Now time for further debate. I recognize the member from Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And any time that I have to stand in my place on behalf of the fine folks of Oshawa and speak about public education is a good day. I came to this House by way of public education as a student, but also as a teacher for not enough time, but also any year in the classroom is a lot. And so I was pleased to spend time in the elementary world as a teacher, and much like my colleague from Thunder Bay Superior North, pursued further education for myself, because if you when you become a teacher, there are some folks who try it and it's not the right fit and they might leave. But those who stick around longer than about 3 years, they mean it, and they're in it. And you know, part of my journey to this House was because we got kicked in the teeth by the government of the day, the Liberals at the time, who were stealing our sick days and doing all sorts of unconstitutional stuff. Bill 115, excuse me, and that riled a lot of us up and turned us into activists and turned us into politicians. There are many on our benches who realized that that was something worth fighting against, and that public education was certainly worth fighting for. Coming to this space and being in this room, we have an opportunity to share the perspectives of our communities. And I will admit that some of the communities across this province are hard to relate to. The members bring experiences from their constituents that maybe I'm not hearing, and that is part of the value of having so many of us in this space, that I am able to stand and talk about what it was like to have been a teacher, which may be unrelatable for some. I'm able to stand and talk about what it's like for those who maybe don't have the advantages, children who don't have the supports that they need, whereas other students do. Right? And I get to tell those stories, and hopefully they're respected and they're considered. And that's what I'm going to take, what I want to do today. Today I want to talk about what we could do with public education and why we should do it. We should be investing in public education. And it's frustrating, when the minister, who may have the best of intentions, right? But when the minister talks about investing in public education and the record numbers or this or that, factoring in inflation, we are short, really, really short. In fact, when inflation is taken into account, it's about $1,200 less per student per year than it was in 2018, 2019. And that's I'm not going to diminish it by saying that's a lot of pencils, but it's a lot of educators, it's a lot of support, it's a lot of needs that are not being met. And the members opposite have spent the day, giving us, challenging us on those numbers. But I challenge you to defend that you're putting enough money in, because the government is not. That they've been bragging about the capital investment, how much money they're putting in the capital budget, but the capital budget to both build new schools and repair existing ones is $14 billion over 10 years at a time when the repair backlog alone is $16 billion. So when the member opposite from Eglinton Lawrence, I'm going to invite you to ask me questions at the end of it, because I can't quite hear you, and I have the right to speak.
You will direct your comments through the chair. We will tone everything down, and you may continue.
I appreciate the reminder, Speaker. I will address my comments through the chair. And I will continue in the same vein, though, that I care. And the kids that I taught many of them are grown-ups now, and it's really a fascinating role that we have, because we've all become very public figures, and a lot of my former students can come and find me and are turning into adults in the community, and it's really very special to continue some of those relationships. When you hear from them, they tell you about their success stories. It's actually quite heartening to have been a part of their journey. And I think that that's true of anyone who goes into education and stays in education, whether they're educational assistants or teachers, administrators, staff, the custodial staff. They love what they do. Schools are communities, and they require investment. And I want to, actually, I'll use someone else's voice here. I've got a letter from Deborah, and Deborah says, quote, "The last few years have undoubtedly revealed the importance of ensuring Ontario students have access to the staff, resources, and learning supports they need as they fully transition back to the classroom after 2+ years of learning in a global pandemic. Government has reiterated time and time again the need to keep students in the classroom, but those classrooms can't be overcrowded, and our students need to be supported by the teachers, educational assistants, early childhood educators, custodial staff, and tens of thousands of other education workers who make up the backbone of our public education system. Without them and the resources they and our students need to learn, Ontario students will fall even further behind. As a voter in Ontario who cares deeply about public education, I want to see our government commit to working with education workers, prioritize our students' needs, and invest in a safe, strong public education system that shows respect for the work that educators do, gives our students the education that they deserve, and builds a public education system that Ontarians can be proud of." And that's from Deborah. And that's, you know, we're all getting letters like that right now. We, as the official opposition, have been calling for a long time to limit class sizes, you know, to have a maximum if it's 15, so that teachers are better able to meet the needs, that students have the resources, have the space, that it increases the quality of education that those kids receive. The government has been lauding that $200 catch-up payment program. And by the way, our office and probably many others in this province are still supporting parents who are waiting on those payments that were approved and still haven't been received. You know, and that's something that it's not. I'm not looking to see that in this bill. That's something that has already been done. But maybe the government could follow through on something. But that is the kind of thing that money could have been invested into in-classroom supports for students. Smaller classroom sizes not only benefit disabled students, but all students. You know, like, let's talk about the universal design for learning. Speaker, I remember implementing strategies that the CERT, or the Special Education Resource Teacher, had come into my room to help me set up and create an appropriate learning environment for specific children with specific special learning needs. And I remember the visual schedule and some of those things that I put up in the classroom ostensibly for this child, and it turns out it was really useful for me too, you know, having that visual, color-coordinated schedule. I'm someone who likes her color-coordinated systems, but that universal design for learning. If we have the resources and supports, we are able to support children and educators and everyone in the school. It also helps to support parents, right? It helps with the communications pieces. But also capping classroom sizes reduces the number of people in a room. And we've just come, you know, we've been living through a pandemic, and we understand that when you have fewer people, you know, we're dealing with spacing, those issues really came to the fore. And here we are underfunding our public education system, which is not the right direction to go. Something else that I would say, the classroom sizes affects learning, it affects the health of the workers and the students. But when it comes to special education, specialized classes, the smaller class sizes, and they're called different things, like the small class placement might be called something different, you know, board to board. But what a difference it makes to children who need more one-on-one support, who need the small class placements. And to know that those are being reduced, like in number. I don't mean number of students reduced in the space, but the numbers of those small class placements across the province, we're seeing board by board that those are diminishing. that fewer students are going to have access to those small classes and the small class placements. That is not okay. The Human Rights Commission has consistently found that boards are unable to regularly and consistently meet the needs of students with disabilities due to a chronic lack of funding from the Ministry of Education that has been ongoing since before this government came to power. And the Human Rights Tribunal has even found that some accommodation requests do constitute an undue burden for boards because the ministry does not live up to its obligations in providing the necessary funding. We're debating a bill called Better Schools and Student Outcomes. I want to talk about better schools and student outcomes. Better schools and student outcomes are going to have the students' best interests at heart. All students. Parents who have disabled children, they often have to seek their own supports, which come with additional costs. In an ideal world, the ministry would take a proactive approach to identify some of the most common disabilities or some different best practices that they could implement across boards. We don't see that proactive approach, but anyway. But funding enough speech therapists or occupational therapists, school nurses, mental health professionals, accessible playgrounds, supports for deaf and blind students. Some schools may already have this, but it should be the standard. That's a bigger conversation, I guess, for another day, but I do hope we get to have it. Beyond the conversation, I hope that we do get to see those changes. At the beginning of the school year, we had a mom whose son just started kindergarten. He's diabetic. He needs insulin injections. Right? The school was requiring the mom to come in and give them to him. Well, she was on maternity leave, so she could, but when she goes back to work, then what happens? We were able to connect her with some community supports, and that's a specific concern, but we all have those in our communities, right? Parents who don't know what to do. Do we turn them to this government? Do you have answers? Does the government have answers? Sorry, through you, Speaker. Here's an email from a mom who said she's writing about her son, who, quote, has not had morning or afternoon recess since the beginning of October 2022. At first, I was thinking it was just an occasional matter, depending on his day, only to find out recently he hasn't been out since then. He is a 7-year-old boy in Oshawa who's diagnosed with autism and recently ADHD. He is not a threat. He gets picked on easily and can be impulsive when provoked. But other than that, he's like every other 7-year-old boy. Under the Human Rights Code, a school has a legal duty to provide accommodations that include inclusiveness and dignity within the school environment, and providing him with an EA should not be undue hardship for them. Due to this behaviour of removing his recess and lunch, it will hurt his dignity and make him a target for bullying at the school by other children. Now, I'll say that this circumstance, this situation, we're helping to support in our office, and I know that we all have like unusual circumstances that we deal with in our community offices. But what this mother has been told by the school is that it's about, quote, manpower. In this case, it's about the lack of resources. So we are doing our work as a community office to connect, and this is where when the government talks about the funding that they're putting in, and we know that there are not enough support staff, that there are not enough educational assistants, that the small number of small class placements across the province are, what we're hearing is that they're at risk, that we're hearing sort of school by school or board by board that the classes there won't be quite as many per board. There isn't the funding needed. And Speaker, again, better schools and student outcomes. Students do better when they have the support that they need. Memory lane is a fun place, so I'll take us on a bit of a journey. I remember when I was early in my teaching, and that was before I had gotten involved I was doing professional development, but I was a new teacher. And finding my way, and I am so grateful that at that time, in the first few years teaching, that there was enough, the resources were such that I had an educational assistant that came to my classroom, and I knew the periods of the day that they were going to be there. And at that time, it wasn't about having an educational assistant for just one child, but I knew it was a predictable schedule, and during that time, oh man, did I appreciate having her there, because I could do small group work, that I could do small assessments. I could do one-on-one, sit with a child at my desk and do, whether it was a reading assessment or something that was, you know, kind of a double check on math skills or whatnot. I could do small group while the educational assistant made herself available or could work with one-on-one a student who had an accommodation in their IEP, their individualized education plan, and was able to work with that student so that they did have what they needed. If it was back then, and the member from London North Centre might remember, do you remember Dragon Naturally Speaking?
Yes.
Okay. So Dragon Naturally Speaking was a chance for a child who maybe didn't have the same literacy skills to be able to speak and tell their story, and once it learned their voice, it could write the story for them. But I could not provide, I'm thinking of a particular student as I'm telling a story. Anyway, but he could not do that in the classroom because the microphone would pick up everybody else's voice. I could not provide a quiet environment in a classroom, quiet enough for this child to do, you know, to write his essays with Dragon Naturally Speaking or whatnot. And so having an educational assistant to work with that child or sit with them in a quiet space, we had opportunities to do whatever it was that was needed in that classroom. And there were rough days, but there were good days. And then you watched things change. And at that time, I didn't really understand why, and I still can't point to exactly what was happening. I just knew I didn't have an EA anymore, and that there were other students that needed one-on-one, and that's fine. But then the educational assistants at other schools later on, they had their walkie-talkies, and they were in the hall, and they were just monitoring runners and behaviors, right, and keeping kids safe. That needs to be done. But at the same time, educational assistants were no longer able to educationally assist. They were doing important work, but whether that's toileting or behavior, the children who require the educational support do not get it. They cannot access it the way that they need. I can try, but when you have, 25 other kids, 29, like whatever, you can only do so much. And I remember being also frustrated, and this was years ago, and things have only gotten worse, but back then, being in IPRCs and the meeting with the CERT and the principal and the parents, and this is something as part of the Education Act, to ensure that children with special needs get specific accommodations. And I'm going to say to the parents watching at home, an IEP that has an IPRC is actually not a wish list. It's supposed to be a document that folks sign, and they say it's a commitment that this is what this child is going to be getting. If that's 3 times a week, that they have a quiet space for assessments or whatever, right? That whatever the accommodation is, I'm going to be loose with my words here and say legally binding, right? But it's part of the Education Act. It's supposed to actually be a thing that we are committing to. Not saying, okay, best case is Johnny would get this, this, this. We'll just tell the parents that's what we're doing. But we all know there is no dang way that we can provide that because we don't have the resources, the supports, the space, the assistance that we need. And I got to the point that I was like, I'm not signing that. I'm not signing that. I'm not signing an IEP when I know that we cannot provide what is in that. And so when teachers who, and that was before I got involved with my union, that was before I was really focused on, all of the things that are around education. For a long time I was a teacher who was just excited to be a teacher, and I loved it. And I miss my kids, I do. Although, like I said, they're all grown up and they come back and haunt me sometimes. But teachers, education workers, they're not having the tools that they need the things that they're reaching for are not there. And under the Education Act, the Ministry of Education is responsible for setting out the process for identification and accommodation. They have to ensure that all exceptional pupils can address or can access special education programs and services without payment of fees. And time again, their kids aren't getting what they need because the government is not funding it. Thank you.
It's now time for questions, and I recognize the member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Listen, I think one of the things that really is neat about this place is we all come from very diverse backgrounds, and want to thank the member from Oshawa for all that she's done for the people of her community. Being a teacher and educator is certainly not an easy job, but she talked a lot about things that are planned through school boards. And when we talk about transparency, and I think, again, I've spoken to this a few times this afternoon, transparency is key to this. And when she's saying that, there's not enough money being put into the system, or, there's not enough EAs, or things aren't happening, these are all things that the board dictates. So one of the stipulations of this bill is that school boards, the 72 school boards across Ontario, will actually have to publicly post their spending and what the money that the Ministry of Education provides to them and how they're allocating that across the board. So, and trying to be as nonpartisan as possible with this question to the member from Oshawa is, does she support that? Does she support open transparency when it comes to board spending?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
Of course, I support transparency with spending, but and I encourage the government to pay very close and careful attention to how short they are in terms of what is required for spending. So when the board is spending, is the government going to ask them what was actually needed? Is the government going to say what more was required? Because the government is forcing the boards to make impossible choices. They cannot hire enough staff to support the students' needs. And
response.
They can tell you where the money's going, they can show you, but are you going to fund them when they show you what is needed?
The questions, I recognize the member for Nickel Belt.
It's very interesting to listen to my colleague about the better school and student outcomes. I come from Nickel Belt. I represent 33 small communities in the north. Most of the kids that I represent have to travel very long distances to make it to their school because there has been many school closure, and the kids go further and further. The kid from Cartier is 4 years old, and she spent 1 hour and 36 minutes to make it to the school and 1 hour and 36 minutes back at night to make it back home. She falls asleep in the bus. She's 4 years old. She gets picked on, and she hates school. She does not want to go to school anymore. She hates it. How is the busing school bus system in your area?
Response.
Gosh, we have so many phone calls from parents that are not even in our riding but across Durham, like Seton parents. The government wants to spend some time calling them back. That'd be great. But the bus drivers, like I have a letter here from a bus driver in my riding, and he says, I need your help. Ontario's student transportation sector is in crisis. School bus delays and cancellations are plaguing the system, leaving students and parents stranded. Parents are being forced to take time off work to drive their kids to and from school. As a driver who takes great pride in driving a school bus, I want this to change. He talks about the fact he's going to have to leave the job due to lack of funding. And the member earlier from Barrie Innisfil, when we were raising busing, said it was neither here nor there. Actually, it's here and there. That's the whole point of a bus. But it's part of the grants for student needs. It's part of the GSN funding, which this government, if they were serious about education, would take a really hard look at the experience of all kids across our province when it comes to education.
For the questions, I recognize the member for Eglinton Lawrence.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And just building on my friend from Kitchener-Conestoga, the member opposite said she did not know why, but suddenly she didn't have an EA anymore. She said that specialized playgrounds should be standard in all schools. She said that small class placement is different from board to board and that they're not doing it anymore, and they don't really know why. Well, we don't either, and that's why we would like to see how boards are spending the money, and then we'll know. And it may be that what we'll know is they need more money because they've spent it all on the right things for special education, best practices, etc. But let's find out, for goodness sake, because we increased funding for special education by $100 million every year since we've been in office, approximately, and we still don't know where that money is going. So let's see. Let's deliver for those kids. Can't you support that?
Back to the member for response.
It's interesting to hear the member talk about accountability when, in this case, there are a lot of decisions in this bill that were made without any consultation with the school board trustees and the folks who are elected to answer to to answer to community members. So let's connect with them as well, because certainly every dollar goes really far in education. And anybody in education knows that there isn't enough, and educators put so much of their, and education workers put so much of their own money into the system. That would be a neat thing for you to ask for in terms of accountability, is ask teachers how much they spend to feed kids, or on socks, or on any like art supplies. That's paid for by education workers and educators. Put that in your accountability. That would be neat.
For the questions, I recognize the member for London West.
Thank you very much, Speaker. I enjoyed hearing my colleague, the member for Oshawa, talk about education. I think we can all imagine her in a classroom and what an engaging, wonderful experience it would be to have her as a teacher. But I wondered if she would comment on the fact that this bill was developed and introduced by this government with absolutely zero consultation with the education workers who are expected to deliver the new programs that the government is again underfunding, but wants school boards to introduce. How important is it to consult with teachers and education workers when bringing in new programs?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
I think it's really important, but I'm going to also say I think it's important across sectors. Right? We know what it is to do this job. Right? As MPPs, we have a pretty good idea of what we need to do our job well. Right? Just like in every other sector, the front lines know what it is that they need, and so I think that purposefully leaving them out, that there wasn't any consultation with anyone who does the work, is an interesting approach. So, there's still time for the government, as this bill is moving through this House, to invite and involve and take their time, because they would hear things that maybe they already know, or things that they do not. And there are lots of recommendations that they would hear from anyone working front lines. Thank you.
For the questions, I recognize the member from Markham Unionville.
Having heard so much about no consultation, there's a very important information you need to know. There was an consultation in 2018, large scale, with 72,000 responses from the Ministry of Education. 61% are parents or guardians. 16% were educators. So why does the opposition want to insist on cutting parents of every stage of their children's education? And this opposition needs to stop trying to speak on behalf of parents and start allowing them to speak for themselves, because we have done a consultation. Parents belong at the table. What makes the member opposite think that they don't?
Back to the member from Oshawa.
So I am grateful that the member opposite is interested in hearing from parents. So this is from a parent, and I read part of it about her 7-year-old son, but she says, I have an amazing rapport with his teacher, who's fantastic, and his CERT. I know they're very burnt out from trying to help him in the classroom while helping other kids to do their work. I'm aware he's not the only one in his class that needs extra help with academics. He could benefit very much from having an EA. I know he's struggling with concentration. Children thrive after a break of running around with physical activity. This is the parent whose child isn't getting the recess, but she has so many questions, and parents are flooding our inboxes with concerns about their students, and it's it's falling at your feet, and you're ignoring it as a government.
Response?
So, you know, you can cite a parent consultation from 2018, but this bill before us, you did not consult on, and that's what everybody who should have been is saying.
Fortunately, we do not have time for further questions.